Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. My name is Haley and I am your host. I work at an OBGYN clinic where I teach women and couples how to chart their cycles so they can either achieve or avoid pregnancy and also to manage their fertility. I have a huge passion to teach women and couples about the beauty of their fertility and how the pill is never the answer to women's health. There's a lot of good and not so good information out there about fertility. And so my goal with this podcast is to help you sort out the truth from the weeds. I want to teach you how to chart your cycle and to reach your family planning goals while also maybe even possibly locating hormonal imbalances and to receive proper treatment. I want to help you get in the best hands that you can with the best doctors that you can to reach optimal reproductive health. So if you're ready to get on this journey with me to learn more about your reproductive system, how it was created and how it should be working, and the best medicine in order to make it work if it's not, then you are in the right place. A few years ago, I picked up a book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. And this book is written by a PhD doctor. Her name is Sarah E. Hill. And she is, first of all, completely secular. So there's a lot of arguments about the pill and about fertility that come from a religious worldview, right? And I do hold some of those religious worldviews, but I think we can have a lot of, there's a lot of benefit that comes from having an argument against the pill and for a natural fertility that are not religious, that are completely secular, because not everybody is religious. And I think that just on the most basic human level, most just natural level of our humanity, of our bodies, the way that the woman's body it works, right? The way that our hormones fluctuate, the way just the science behind our bodies really reveal so much of the arguments against the pill, because it is just so unnatural to our body. And so it goes against everything that our body is in a healthy sense trying to do. And so I picked up this book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, and she really does oh my gosh, you guys, an amazing job, a phenomenal job of outlining, first of all, just the ebb and flow of women's hormones when they are ebbing and flowing in a healthy way, the way that they should be. And so the first part of her book is really just going through that, right? And explaining the female body, the female reproductive system, your sex hormones, all of those types of things. And then she goes into how the pill, first of all, how the pill works, the mechanism of the pill, and then how that affects all of the things that she explained at the beginning of the book with how your body is actually supposed to work. So it was just such a good read. It's actually a very fast read. It sounds like a more scientific book, which it is, but I've never read such a scientific book that also like makes you laugh. I remember reading part of this in a coffee shop a few years ago, and I was actually like kind of chuckling under my breath because she's hilarious. It is such a good book. I will say, just kind of a caveat, the one thing, well, there's maybe two things. The first thing, I guess I should say, that I don't necessarily love about the book is just that she and I do have a different ethics behind fertility. And so there's that. So whenever I recommend this book to people, I always just kind of give that caveat. Like, I don't agree with everything she says in this book, but I think she does do a very good job of explaining just the mechanism of the female body and the pill. So there's that. But then the other thing that I just wish she would have done is at the very end of the book, I guess I should say I wish she wouldn't have done. So the very end of the book, pretty much like last chapter, she says the whole book is outlining how bad the pill is for you. I mean, that's how unnatural the pill is for you. And then at the very end of the book, she says, but if this is the option you choose, you have the right to do that. And I just think she should have said that differently I just think she shouldn't have said that. I think if she's going to write a book about how the pill is ruining your brain and ruining your dating life and ruining your body, like, I think she should have run home with that and said there are better options. And maybe she doesn't know any better options, because the better options that are out there aren't necessarily most well known. And that's one of the reasons that I even started this podcast, is to really explain how, starting to chart your fertility and understanding your body and maybe your hormone imbalances by charting your fertility. That's a really good start. And then moving from there, finding a doctor that can read that chart, so on and so forth. So those are the two main things, kind of caveats that I like to give. But other than that, though, this book is really, really, really good. And so I thought it would be fun to do more or less a 3-part series on this book. Not everything from this is going to be coming from this book specifically, but because a lot of it, I just, these are things that I teach to women who are wanting to learn how to chart their cycle. I teach how their body works. And I do like to go into, how the pill actually works, because very, very few women are actually familiar with that and are actually taught that. And so I think this is going to be a 3-part series. And this is actually going to reflect a talk that I did in the last few months to a group of young adult women. And it was based on this book. And so I wrote this talk to really explain how your body works, how the pill affects that, and ultimately how this all affects your dating life. So the talk that I gave was actually called How Your Hormones Are Messing with Your Dating Life, which was very interesting to do research on and learn very interesting things about, and kind of frightening things about. So I'm going to split this up into 3 parts. So today's part is going to be just the anatomy and hormones, because we have to understand that before we get into understanding how your natural hormones are affecting your dating life, and then how the pill disrupts your dating life. That's more or less the 3 parts that I put this talk into. So today is going to be anatomy and hormones. I'm going to outline those again, the 4 main sex hormones that you have as a woman and how they should naturally be ebbing and flowing. We'll talk a little bit about the reproductive anatomy, because you just that is the foundation, right? We have to lay a good foundation of understanding the way our bodies should work in order to understand how that affects everything else. So without further ado, let's get into this first part of anatomy and hormones. The second and third parts will be more about how our hormones affect our dating life and how the pill then disrupts our dating life. So, anatomy and hormones. First of all, what even are hormones? Let's actually start there, because I think the word hormones gets thrown around a whole lot, but we don't always understand exactly what they are. So this is a definition I actually did get from This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. It's from page 36, and she gives us a definition for hormones. So she says, hormones are signaling molecules that get synthesized in one part of your body and then are released into the bloodstream and picked up by any cells in the body that have matching hormone receptors. Okay, so to kind of bring that down to a layperson level, they are chemical signals that are traveling from one part of your body to another, and then they will regulate different processes within your body. So there are hormones. Hormones are in charge of every single process of your body. Now, specifically today, we're going to be talking about the reproductive hormones, your sex hormones, to specifically talk about your reproductive system. But just knowing that hormones there are gazillion hormones that are in charge of the processes in your body. So starting from that, right? Now, looking also at the female reproductive anatomy before we dive deeper into those different type of hormones. So if you obviously podcast, I can't show you a picture, unfortunately. So if you were to even Google like cartoon image of a uterus, you'll probably find it. And actually in the presentation kind of PowerPoint that I used for this presentation that I gave, I literally found like a cartoon image of female reproductive anatomy from Canva. So it's very easy to find if you wanted to be able to kind of to actually look at what I'm talking about. But we'll start with the ovaries, right? every woman, well, I should say most women, right? A healthy reproductive system has 2 ovaries. So one on each side of her uterus. And so these ovaries, it's really actually quite interesting. The ovaries contain all of the eggs that a woman will ever have. So let's actually think about this for a second, because when does she get all of these eggs? Well, the peak number of eggs that a woman will ever have, we have a set amount of eggs. The most amount of eggs that we will ever have is when we are 20 weeks gestation within our mother's womb. You guys, isn't that insane? When we are 20 weeks gestation inside of our mother's womb, in our tiny little baby ovaries, we have the peak number of eggs that we will ever have, you guys. And so at that point, it's just a matter of them either kind of depleting and going back, being absorbed back into the body, or once you are born and then you live another decade or so, and you start to actually hit puberty and start to ovulate and start your cycle, those eggs are then ovulated. So you have a set number of eggs. And so that means that there is a time in our life where we will no longer have any more eggs. And that time is called menopause. So our fertility life, like our fertile life as women, starts when we hit puberty and when we start to actually ovulate, and that egg is released from the ovary and we actually start to have our period. It starts then, and then it ends around age 50, I should say. Sometimes for women it's a little earlier, sometimes for women it's a little later, but I think 50 is around the average of when at least you start to enter menopause. And so in the fullness of menopause is when you don't have any more eggs left, and so you're done. So there's a set amount of time too that women have where we are actually fertile. And then at that, we are actually not even fertile for every day of the cycle. There's only a very specific amount of time that we are actually fertile, meaning if we had intercourse, we could get pregnant. There's a very specific, very short amount of time during every single cycle that's even possible. So throughout our whole life, throughout our whole fertility journey in our life, there's very, very small pockets of windows where we are actually fertile. And so part of the reason for learning how to chart your cycle is because we're looking for when you are fertile. So that if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, you would avoid intercourse during those fertile times. And then if you're trying to achieve pregnancy, you can focus intercourse during those fertile times. So it's true family planning in the sense that you can plan to avoid and you can plan to achieve. You can and you can change your mind on any given day of what that intention is, because it's completely based on your behavior. So with that, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But anyways, with that being said, right, we have 2 ovaries, one on each side, and those ovaries contain all of the eggs that we will ever have. So at ovulation, that's when an egg is released from that ovary. And the ovaries actually take turns ovulating typically. So you'll ovulate from the left ovary one cycle, the right ovary the next cycle, and you kind of just go back and forth. So if I've talked to women sometimes who they'll say they have painful periods or painful ovulation, but it's every other cycle. It's not consistently with every cycle. That typically means that there's something going on with that one ovary because of the fact that they oscillate. They take turns ovulating. So more just kind of a fun, maybe not so fun fact there, but to give an explanation for that. So 2 ovaries. Then from those ovaries, we have the fallopian tubes. So the fallopian tubes on the side of the ovary, it actually has something called the fimbria. And these are finger-like projections that they kind of float over the ovary. And so these are extending from the fallopian tube. And these finger-like projections are what catch the egg. So when an egg is released from the ovary, these fimbria will kind of swoop the egg up and then bring the egg then into and through the fallopian tube. So if conception happens where an egg is fertilized by a sperm cell, that's actually going to happen in the fallopian tube. A brand new human life is going to be conceived typically in the outer third of the fallopian tube, so closer to where the ovary is. And then it's a matter of about a week, maybe 10 days of that new life traveling through the fallopian tube to then enter to the uterus and implant in the uterine lining, or the inside lining of the uterus. So also fun fact there. But we have the ovaries, we have the fallopian tubes on each side. The fallopian tubes then connect to the uterus. So the uterus is about the size of an inverted pear, actually. An upside down pear is more or less the shape. And the uterus is where a baby is housed for 9 months if a woman is pregnant, right? It's super, super elastic. It's very flexible because it has to accommodate a baby. So the uterus is very flexible. And then on the inside of the uterus, we have what's called the endometrium, or also better known as maybe the uterine lining. And so this uterine lining is being replenished every single cycle, because this is the period. This is the bleeding that you see when you're on your period, is this uterine lining. It's this endometrium. And so at the very, very end of your cycle, when your period is about to come, your hormones drop, your progesterone and estrogen drop. And we'll talk about those hormones here in a minute. But your hormones drop, and that's what triggers your next period. And so it's the uterine lining that's being kind of shed or sloughed off of the insides of the uterus. And that's the bleeding that you see. So then after your period, throughout the rest of your cycle, that uterine lining is being regenerated. It's being thickened again. And so it starts out not super thick, right? Because it's completely gone. It's completely sloughed off. And so it needs to regenerate. And so over the time of that next cycle, it begins to thicken and thicken and thicken. And it's because of the fact that if a woman were to get pregnant, it's this uterine lining that's where that embryo is going to implant, that new life is going to implant, and that's where it's going to receive a lot of its nutrients. And so this uterine lining, it's very, very important that it's regenerating properly, because if a woman gets pregnant, this is going to be the environment that new life is going to continue to grow and be nourished and sustained. So it's very, very important that it continues to thicken and replenish itself like it should. And that's all being done by hormones. So you have the uterus, you have the uterine lining, which is called the endometrium. Right below the uterus, you have the cervix. And so the cervix is a canal. We could also call it the cervical canal. And so there's a hole in the middle. And within the hole, within this canal, there are what we call cervical crypts. And they're these little tiny openings within your cervix. And these cervical crypts are where this cervical mucus or the cervical fluid is produced. Now, if you've listened to any one of my podcasts, you'll know how important cervical mucus is, right? If you're charting your cycle, this is really the main thing that you are looking for when you're understanding your fertility, because the cervical mucus is a direct reflection of your hormones. So by observing this type of fluid that your cervix is producing can tell us so much about your hormone balances and about what hormones are dominant, and just gathering data, gathering information on your hormone ebb and flow, and to see if there's any hormone imbalances. This can be seen by observing your cervical fluid. So although some people may find it yucky, it is such good data. It is such good information that helps us understand your body and your ebb and flow of your hormones. So getting back then into the swing of hormones, there are 4 main reproductive hormones, female reproductive hormones, that I want to go over, because these are the main players of your whole cycle. These are really what orchestrate the cycle. So we've got estrogen and progesterone. These are the 2 main female sex hormones that we probably have heard of, at least. And then we have FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. I'll talk about that. And then we have LH, which is luteinizing hormone. So these 4 main hormones are really what orchestrate your whole cycle. So before diving deep into those 4 main hormones, though, I do want to emphasize that when we're looking at the full cycle, and when I say cycle, obviously I'm talking about your menstrual cycle, I'm talking about from the first day of your period until the last day before your next period. So your cycle is not just your period itself. It's not just the bleeding you see, but it's the whole cycle. It's from one period to the next. So when we're talking about that cycle, we can separate it into two different phases. So there's the follicular phase and then the luteal phase. So the follicular phase is going to be from day 1 of your cycle, which is day 1 of bright red blood flow, until ovulation. So we could also call this phase the pre-ovulation phase, just because it's all before ovulation. So from day 1 up until ovulation, we have this follicular or pre-ovulation phase. And so this phase can be really variable. For women with regular, kind of like the 30-day cycle, this phase is about 2 weeks. But for women that have longer cycles or irregular cycles, it's this phase that's going to be a lot more variable. It might be a lot longer. It might be, for the women that have irregular cycles, it's going to be this phase of the cycle that's all over the place with length. The luteal phase, however, which is the second phase, this is going to be from the day after ovulation through the rest of the cycle. So we could also call this post-ovulation. All right, so we have the follicular phase, which is the pre-ovulation phase. Then we have the luteal phase, which is the post-ovulation phase. This luteal phase, should be very stable. So the general range of days that we see, typically for all women, we usually give about 9 to 17 days range and that's a range for all women for this luteal phase. However, that should not be the range for every specific woman though, because every specific woman, she really actually has her own range of what is typical for her. And that range is a whole lot smaller. So just to give you an example, let's say I'm working with a woman who typically has about 15 days of her luteal phase. In general, it's about 2 weeks, but let's say this woman has about 15 days. Okay, it would be fine if we saw one cycle have 14 days of a luteal phase. It would be fine if we saw a cycle that had 16 days of a luteal phase. But if I saw that specific woman have then a 10-day luteal phase, so a 10-day post-ovulation phase, 10 is between 9 and 17, so it's between like the general range for all women, but that would be a red flag for her. That would be a sign that maybe her progesterone is a little off and we need to take a look at that. Could be other things too, but that's kind of the first thing we look at. So the luteal phase should be very stable. And if it's not, that can be a sign of hormonal imbalance. So even just by the length of the cycle and then the length of the two phases of the cycle, this can already give us really good information about your hormone fluctuations. So then let's actually get then into those 4 main hormones that I talked about. So the first one is the follicle stimulating hormone. So this is also known as FSH. So this is a hormone that actually comes from the pituitary gland of your brain. And its main job is to stimulate the follicles in your ovaries every cycle. So let's kind of iron out what that actually means. So I talked about already that you have eggs. You have all of the eggs that you'll ever have. And there's going to typically be one egg every cycle that's ovulated. We only ovulate one time every cycle. If there is a second or third ovulation, which is not common to happen, but it can happen, that second or third ovulation will not happen any later than 24 hours of the first ovulation. So we're not going to ovulate today and then ovulate again next week. It's just not how our bodies work. So we have the eggs within our ovary, and one egg typically will be ovulated every cycle. Now, before this ovulation, though, we have this hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, that's actually, it's kind of recruiting a few eggs to start to grow a follicle around it. So a follicle is really just a cyst, but it's a healthy cyst. It's a cyst that should be there, and it grows on top of the ovary. And really this follicle is the main job in the pre-ovulation phase, or the follicular phase, is that it is the house of the egg. So this follicle starts to grow around the egg, and it's growing in response to this follicle stimulating hormone. This hormone, it's named properly because it's doing exactly what it says it should be doing. It's stimulating the follicle to grow around the egg. And so typically by the time that the follicle is mature and you're getting right toward ovulation, there's typically one egg that becomes dominant of kind of the few that were recruited at the very beginning of the cycle. There's one that becomes dominant, and that's the one that's going to be released at ovulation. So the follicle stimulating hormone, its main job is to stimulate those follicles and then really choose that dominant egg, which has a dominant follicle around it. And that's what's the egg that's going to ovulate. So at ovulation, that follicle will rupture, and that's what allows the egg to leave the ovary. So this follicle stimulating hormone, the levels of FSH are going to be higher in the pre-ovulation phase because of its job. Its job is to stimulate those follicles around the eggs. And so, so this hormone is doing exactly that. Now, on the flip side of things, at the same time, let's talk about estrogen. So estrogen is coming from your ovary. So unlike FSH, which is coming from your brain, estrogen comes from your ovary. And so estrogen has a lot of jobs. Okay. And I don't even know the half of them because I'm not a doctor, but it has a whole lot of jobs. But I do know a whole lot about estrogen in the sense of how it affects your fertility. So your estrogen, one of the things that it does is that it talks to your cervix to produce cervical fluid or cervical mucus, right? And I've already talked about that a little bit, but within those cervical crypts, you have this cervical fluid that's being produced in response to estrogen. And so estrogen, it's pretty low until you are past your period. Once your period is over, your estrogen does start to climb again. And so as your estrogen is making that climb, at the very beginning of the climb, you might start to see some cervical fluid that's really sticky. It looks kind of maybe gluey. It looks really, it's white. It's not super stretchy, not super slippery, right? It's just kind of like discharge. It's stuff that's there. Now, as estrogen continues to rise, it starts to change the appearance of this cervical fluid to be more stretchy, to be more clear in color, and to become really slippery. If you guys have ever, this might be TMI, but whatever, this whole podcast is TMI. If you've ever wiped and it's like you're hydroplaning, I mean, it is, it is so slippery that you can thank estrogen for that. That's typically estrogen at its peak, and it causes this cervical fluid to be really, really slippery, really stretchy, really clear. And this cervical mucus is vital for a healthy fertility because sperm love cervical mucus. I have a whole podcast, probably even multiple episodes at this point, about cervical fluid. So I will put a link to that episode in the show notes. But sperm love cervical mucus. So if your body isn't producing enough good quality cervical mucus due to estrogen, it's going to be really, really difficult to get pregnant because of the fact that your body needs to be producing this cervical fluid, this cervical mucus. I use those terms interchangeably, just FYI. We need to be producing this cervical fluid in order for sperm to stay alive long enough within our body after an active intercourse to actually be able to reach the egg to then fertilize the egg. So estrogen is so, so important for this production of cervical mucus. And so again, estrogen is going to be dominant in the pre-ovulation phase. So I think this term estrogen dominance, that's kind of become kind of a common thing that we hear in this world is estrogen dominance, and it's typically shown as a negative thing. And that's not to say that it's not a negative thing, because if estrogen is dominant at all times throughout your cycle, or if it's dominant at times in your cycle where it shouldn't be dominant, then we have a problem. But in this pre-ovulation phase, especially as we are getting closer and closer to ovulation, estrogen is dominant. It should be dominant because it is talking to your cervix and causing your cervix to produce this mucus, which is vital for pregnancy. And if pregnancy is going to happen, that means intercourse needs to happen around the time of ovulation. So all of this is happening around the time of ovulation because your body is preparing for a possible pregnancy. It's preparing for possible conception. So estrogen, however, does still rise in the post-ovulation phase. So it has a steady climb up until ovulation. So we're still talking about the pre-ovulation phase, right? It has a steady climb up until ovulation. Once ovulation happens, estrogen drops. It drops very significantly. It does have another smaller rise in the post-ovulation phase, but there's a different hormone that should be dominant in that phase. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But the last thing I want to talk about estrogen doing is that it thickens the uterine lining. So I've already talked about that uterine lining, that endometrium that needs to be thickened. It's regenerating every single cycle. And so it's starting to thicken up again in that pre-ovulation phase due to estrogen. Okay, that's estrogen. Now, let's move back to our brain and let's talk about luteinizing hormone. So we've had FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. Then we have estrogen, which is coming from your ovary, FSH coming from your brain. Luteinizing hormone is also coming from your brain. So it's coming from the pituitary gland in your brain, the same place where FSH is coming from. And LH triggers ovulation. So this luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation to happen. So this hormone has a very, very sharp peak at one time, should at one time of your cycle. Now, if you have things like PCOS or super, super long cycles, sometimes LH is a little all over the place. And that is something that needs to be healed. That's something that needs to be addressed. So in a healthy reproductive cycle, LH is going to rise one time, peaks only for about 12 to 36 hours of your cycle. Otherwise, LH is very low. It has this peak right, if we're looking at a typical cycle, it's right in the middle of your cycle. And this is what causes ovulation to happen. So if you've heard of women that are using LH strips or using urine strips that you can pee on and it tells you your hormone balances around the time of ovulation, those strips are testing this hormone, this luteinizing hormone, LH. Because when LH is high, that means that ovulation is imminent. It should be coming within the next 12 to 36 hours. So if you're peeing on a stick, that tells you your LH levels. Then especially if you're trying to time conception, that would be a very, very good time to engage in intercourse if you're trying to achieve pregnancy. So LH is really the ovulation hormone when you think about it. So that's that coming from your brain. And now let's talk about the other female reproductive sex hormone that's coming from your ovary. We talked about estrogen. Now we're talking about progesterone. So again, coming from your ovary. And again, this hormone talks to your cervix, but it tells the cervix to do something completely different than what estrogen is doing. Estrogen tells your cervix to produce this cervical mucus. Progesterone tells your cervix to stop the production of cervical mucus. It will dry up all of that cervical mucus. And this hormone is very dominant in the post-ovulation phase. So remember how I said estrogen does have a small rise in the post-ovulation phase, but the main player, the dominant hormone should be or is progesterone. So progesterone is called progesterone because it is a pro-gestation hormone. It readies the body for pregnancy. So every single cycle, no matter what behavior you're doing, your body is going to be preparing for pregnancy. Whether you're having intercourse or not, once you ovulate and progesterone begins to rise, your body is starting to prepare for receiving a new life. So we call it this progestation hormone. So there's 5 main things that progesterone is doing that is preparing your body to receive and sustain a possible new life. Your body's going to pretend it's pregnant until it realizes it's not. So whether you are pregnant or not, whether you're having intercourse or not, your body is doing this every single cycle just in case you are pregnant until it realizes that you're not. So again, the first thing I've already mentioned that progesterone does is that it dries up that cervical mucus. First of all, because once you ovulate, you're not going to ovulate again. So once you ovulate and you're past ovulation, if the egg has died, so it has not been fertilized by a sperm cell, the egg has died, you're not going to ovulate again that cycle. So that means that you're completely infertile the rest of that cycle, because if we don't have an egg, we don't have a baby. So it dries up that cervical mucus because there's no more mucus that's needed to sustain the sperm to hit the egg, because we don't have an egg. So there's no more mucus that's really needed for the sake of pregnancy. But then also it inhibits any sperm or bacteria from entering the uterus anymore, because it creates more or less like a cervix, or a mucus plug within your cervix. And so it inhibits sperm from traveling through, but then it also inhibits any bacteria from traveling through. And that's because if there is a new life conceived within your body, it's protecting that new life from any of that unwanted things. So like bacteria, right, from entering the uterus and harming the baby. So that's the first thing. It dries up the cervical mucus. The second thing that progesterone is doing is that it increases your body temperature. So if you've ever like raised baby chicks growing up, if you're trying to keep them alive in your little Home Depot bucket, and you have a bunch of eggs at the bottom of that bucket, you always need a heat lamp. Because in order for those eggs to continue to mature and to grow, and then to finally be hatched into little baby chicks, they need heat. Heat is super important just to sustain human life. And so your body actually increases in its temperature to sustain this new life, if there is one there. So progesterone is a thermogenic hormone. So if you've heard of women that are checking their temperature in order to understand their fertility, this is why they're checking for their progesterone levels. And so as your progesterone rises, your body temperature is going to rise, again, for the sake of preserving and sustaining that new life, if there is one there. The third thing progesterone does is that it continues to thicken the uterine lining. So estrogen did have a part of that, right? Estrogen did start to thicken the uterine lining, but progesterone takes it and continues that thickening process. Now, another really cool thing, however, and this is the fourth thing that is really hinging on this thickening the uterine lining, is that this lining, as it's being affected by progesterone, there's these little cavities that start to produce within the uterine lining. And these cavities are producing a very nutrient-filled fluid. We call this an endometrial fluid. And this fluid, I said already, it's high in nutrients, because if there is a new life, this embryo that's being implanted within the uterine lining, this nutrient-filled fluid is giving nutrients to this new life until the placenta starts to build and take over, right? But in the very beginning of pregnancy, this nutrient-filled fluid is what is continuing to sustain, one of the things that's continuing to sustain the life of this new human. So, and then lastly, with progesterone, it's inhibiting any further ovulation, right? We've already talked about that too, where you're only ovulating once. If it happens a second or third time, it's still going to only happen within a day of the first. So once progesterone starts to rise, it's inhibiting any further ovulation. So progesterone in this post-ovulation phase, in this luteal phase, it is the main player. So progesterone in the pre-ovulation phase is like null. Like there's none of it. It's not even, it shouldn't be even detected on a blood test. Like there's nothing there. Post-ovulation, it is dominant, and it should stay high for about 2 weeks. Now, again, I already mentioned how long the luteal phase should be, right? And so I usually just use the term 2 weeks, because that's just the general for all women, right? 2 weeks post-ovulation is how long your body takes to recognize whether you're pregnant or not. So if you are pregnant, your body will continue to produce progesterone to continue to sustain the life of this, or the life of this new human being. Now, what's really cool too is that the baby also produces progesterone. So there's like a progesterone party going on when pregnancy is occurring, especially in early pregnancy. And so what can happen if progesterone is too low is that the woman's body might have a really hard time sustaining that pregnancy. So we always want to make sure that even if a woman is not necessarily trying to get pregnant, or she's not pregnant yet, we want to make sure her progesterone levels are still adequate, right? For the sake of her health, but also for the sake of if she does get pregnant, to be able to sustain that pregnancy and continue the life of that new human. So we have that, right? Your body takes about 2 weeks to recognize if you're pregnant. If you're not pregnant, your body says, oh, okay, I don't need any of these things that I've been preparing for, right? I don't need this high temperature. I don't need this uterine lining anymore. I don't need these nutrients that are within the uterine lining. I don't need to be drying up mucus anymore, all of that stuff. Your progesterone says, okay, I'm no longer needed. Progesterone drops, and estrogen also drops, right? Because estrogen has a small increase in the post-ovulation phase. Those hormones drop, and that's what triggers your next period, and the whole thing starts all over again. So these are the 4 main female reproductive hormones. So FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, estrogen, luteinizing hormone or LH, and then progesterone, the 4 main hormones. So that is what I have for you guys today. That is really the first part, laying the foundation of understanding your body, understanding your hormones, and understanding how the pill will affect and disrupt those hormones. And bonus, how it all affects your dating life. So if you want to stick around for next week and the week after, I will be talking more about, okay, how do these hormones actually play into our dating life? And then that 3rd episode is going to be how the pill disrupts those hormones and how that affects your dating life. So we will talk about that all in the weeks to come. Thanks for sticking around today. And if you have any questions about your hormones, about your reproductive system, about the pill, really anything, or even just if you want to check out this book too, and you want to, I'll put a link in the show notes below to this book. But with all this being said, I do now have an Instagram. I have a love-hate relationship with social media, and it's mostly hate. And it really just disrupts my family life. So I've made just kind of a personal decision, a personal resolve to not be on social media. And I made that years ago, but for the sake of being available to my listeners and to people that are interested in learning how to chart, I did create an Instagram. However, I have 3 posts on there, and that's it. That's all I'm going to post. I'm not doing anything fancy, anything crazy. I'm not going with the algorithm. I'm just there. So, and that is for the sake of, if you have any questions and you want to shoot me a DM, you are absolutely welcome to do so. I look at my DMs probably about once a week. So if I don't get back to you right away, that's why, but I am there. So I'm present there. And so please go check that out, follow me, and all the things. If you're more of an email person, like I truly am, you can also email me at haley@truthandfertility.com. That's HALEY@truthandfertility.com. You can also go to truthandfertility.com to learn more. And if you are interested in learning how to chart your cycle and start to understand these ebbs and flows in your hormones, I'd love to work with you. So more information about that at my website and on my Instagram. All right, you guys, it's been so good chatting with you today, and I'll see you again next week for part 2. Thank you for listening to the Truth and Fertility podcast. If you are enjoying this content, it would be amazing if you could leave a 5-star review. That helps me tremendously to be able to continue to produce these episodes for you. Remember that these podcasts are available on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon, and YouTube. And you can always go to my website, truthandfertility.com, to learn more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week.